Welcome to What is Good, a podcast from the Texas Baptist Christian Life Commission, where we explore contemporary cultural issues through a biblical lens. Micah 6:8 says that God has told us what is good, that we're to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with Him. So whether you're seeking a better understanding of how to live that out, or you're just curious to understand a Christian perspective of what's happening in our culture, we hope that you'll find today's conversation helpful as we discuss what is good. All right, welcome back, and thank you for joining us on another episode of What is Good, a podcast of the Christian Life Commission, where we don't talk about what is slightly above average, we don't talk about what is ordinary, we don't talk about what is meh, we talk about what is good. I am John Litzler, the Director of Public Policy for the Christian Life Commission, and I am hosting today's episode, and we have all of our directors on today. Dr. David Sanchez, Director of Ethics and Justice. Hi, David.
Hey, John. Excited for today's topic.
Me too. And we have our Director of Hunger Care, Dr. Irene Gallegos. Hi, Irene.
Hello.
And finally, our intrepid leader, our boss, head honcho of the Christian Life Commission, our director, Dr. Katie Fruge.
I just get the angry emails is all. That's really what I do.
That's why we're all so thankful and want to point out who the angry emails go to each episode.
It's true. It's very true. And I just forward it to you guys to deal with. No. It's good to be here. I'm very excited about today's episode. This is one that I am very excited to talk about.
Good. So let's dig right into it. We're talking today about Christian advocacy. And advocacy is obviously one of the things that the Christian Life Commission does. And of course, we do it from a Christian perspective. And we are all Christians, and so that is our worldview that we bring to the sphere of advocacy. So we're going to be talking about that. But before we dig into that specifically, my first question for you is this, and it's like a classic timeless debate. If you could have any superpower, what would it be? And you also have to tell us why it would be that thing.
All right. Well, I thought through a lot of them, and I was overthinking it, because first I thought flight, but then I thought, well, if it's just flight, I'm not like impenetrable or anything. That just makes me easier to get shot at.
That's so
and also
dark.
It's very hard to carry all my books. I said I overthought it. Okay. Then I thought about like healing touch, being able to heal others, but I don't want to start a cult. And I think people would end up worshiping me if I could just do that on command.
Ooh, yeah.
Or try to market me or something. You know, it would get twisted by our depravity so quickly. So I finally went with talking to animals and befriending wild beasts.
Awesome. That is the Snow White power.
Yeah, and that, I just protect my family from the neighborhood stray dogs and cats, and occasionally go into the wild on my own and hang out, and just not make a big deal of it.
When my daughter Eve was about 10 years old, she got really into a series called Upside Down Magic, and that's one of the powers. Like, there's certain types of powers people are born with, and that was one of them, and that was always the coolest one to me.
Isn't that one of the special gifts in Encanto?
Yes.
Yes.
The little boy,
yeah.
That's what he receives.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, I definitely thought mine through like David, but like I landed on a lame one because it's not as exciting. I think every scenario I thought through, it just kept overthinking. If I could just have a way to be more creative, especially to de-escalate a toddler, I would love to have that. My mom is fantastic. She was a teacher assistant for 32 years in an elementary school, and she just has this, in my opinion, superpower, but this gift to just, when you have a child who is so frustrated at something, she just turns things into a lighter atmosphere, like a game. And she still disciplines and she still teaches a lesson, but she just does it with such grace and this beautiful ability that I just think, I wish I could do that. I wish I could approach tantrums, maybe it would be helpful not just for toddlers but adults, with such creativity and grace.
Wow.
That's awesome.
That is not lame, and now I feel really shallow to follow up from something like that. Actual superheroes working in public education and trying to emulate them. Yeah. Okay, well, I'll follow up with that. No, so mine, a little bit of context because this is actually a great question, and I've thought about this like all of us have a lot. So bigger context, one of my favorite kind of story, like movies, not comics, but just movies, is X-Men. I just think X-Men is a great storyline. It's fun. And a few years ago, I was diagnosed with a genetic mutation, and just to kind of make light of a difficult situation, I was like, I'm a mutant now. Like, I can finally be just like my favorite superpowers. So, in light of that, one of my favorite mutations that you see different people have in the X-Men universe is the teleportation, being able to just like think about where you want to go and go there. And man, y'all know I have a very, very long commute into the office, and it's just, my life would be so much easier if I could just teleport wherever I wanted to go. You know, that would just make my life easier. I would have so much fun. So while I am a mutant and proud, I don't have the mutation that I'd really like.
I love, for a second, I thought we were going to have the same one, Katie, because I love where you went with that. When I think of superpowers, I definitely think more of X-Men than I think of, like, you know, DC or Marvel or, you know, that kind of stuff. And mine is telekinesis. So I want the ability to, like, move things, objects with my minds, have, you know, the mental state impact physical objects, the non-physical impact the physical objects. So when you said teleportation, I thought you were going to say telekinesis for a second. I was like, oh my goodness, we're going the same way on this. And none of us said like some of the classic ones like invisibility or flight, which David thought about, but chose not to.
Because he didn't want to be shot down.
You're right. But if you had telekinesis, you could stop the bullets with your mind.
I love it.
But you only get one.
But you only get one. Yeah, so let me ask this follow-up question, which I didn't put in our show notes because I wanted your genuine reaction to it. I didn't want you to think about it ahead of time. But a lot of times, Irene excluded, a lot of times when we think about our superhero powers, we immediately go to something that's self-serving, right? Something that's going to help us. For example, you know, teleportation would really help with your commute. And, you know, I could protect my family if I could talk to animals or whatever. But let me ask you this. With the superpower that you named, how could you help others? What could you do for others with that superpower that would be helpful?
Well, I feel like I'm not excluded because truthfully, yes, I wanted to de-escalate others, but it's more to avoid personal stress. So there were selfish motives in there. But and genuinely, yes, to be able, you know, mine would be to be able to help de-escalate situations with creativity, and that I think that would just be very kind for others to be able to receive that level of grace.
I'm thinking being able to train seeing eye dogs a lot faster.
Oh, that's such a great use of that power.
Yeah. Or in situations you have like the Tiger King where someone has a very violent animal that they're taking care of. I can talk to the animal and express to the person owning it, yeah, he actually does want to eat you eventually. Get rid of him.
You could end all animal abuse. Every animal, every pet you saw, you could ask them if they were being treated well.
Wow. You
could just go to dog parks and double check.
I can't follow you people. This is like really hard. If we're following the X-Men universe, I think a lot of times people who had the power of teleportation, like if you hugged the person, like you could take them with you. So I guess maybe I could help people like go see loved ones or family members that they wouldn't be able to access. I'm just really kind of trying to make up something.
I got you, Katie. Emergency care flight is a thing of the past.
Oh, yeah. There we go.
You need someone needs an organ doned, and instead of just having to helicopter or airplane it there, poof, it's right there.
What David said. Thank you, David.
Fresh out of the body.
That's amazing. I love that. No more life flights or any of that kind of stuff. Katie's got you. I think I might just ride around with like Texas on missions, and you know how they go in after disasters and stuff, and like, you know, trees that are falling and blocking roads or whatever, just move it with my mind. And, you know, I can't operate a chainsaw as well as they can, but maybe I could tag along with them and help get some of those objects out of the way.
John is disaster relief in a person right there.
That would be my superhero name, Mr. Disaster Relief or something. I'd have a
And I'd bring all the therapy dogs behind you to soothe people.
There you go.
So part of the reason I wanted to ask that follow-up question, though, is because, I think a lot of times when we think of advocacy, when we don't delve into what advocacy is, our natural inclination is self-advocacy. I'm really good at advocating for what I need, right? I know well what I need. And so if you ask me what I need, I can tell you right now. But if you ask me what other people need in my community, I might have to pause and think about it for a little bit. I don't know. What are the needs in my community? I know what I need, but what do other folks that I know need? What about the people in my church and what do they need? What about the people in town? What do they need? And superhero powers are kind of the same way. When you ask that classic question, invisibility or flight, you immediately start thinking, okay, how could I use this that would be fun for me or, make me into a superhero or whatever? But as Irene has helped us realize, real superheroes serve others and help others, right? And so the real question is not how would you use your powers to serve yourself, but like Superman, how would you use your powers to benefit humanity around you? And so it's a similar question with advocacy, right? There's nothing wrong with self-advocacy, but what would we do to advocate for others and help others? And so with that in mind, I would love to hear from each of you guys an example of advocacy, whether it's real or fictional, that has impacted your life in a meaningful way. And then I'm immediately going to follow up with this question, so be thinking about this one too. I would love to hear from you a time when you engaged in advocacy, either on behalf of yourself or someone else or both, and then kind of tell us a little bit what that was like. Some questions to think in mind of what that might be like was, did it come naturally to engage in advocacy? What was the end result there, positive or negative? Regardless of the end result, are you still glad that you stood up and did it, that you advocated in that way? So first, I'm just interested to hear from each of you an example, whether real or fictional, of advocacy and how that has impacted you.
The first thing that came to my mind was a former role that I had pretty fresh out of grad school. I worked as a health advocate in domestic violence shelters. And so literally in the name. And what we would do, one of the areas that we would work in is help women in shelter, whether that was at the domestic violence shelters or even individuals receiving victim services at a rape crisis center, in helping them with their health. And so that was navigating the healthcare system, that was working on personal health goals, whatever that may look like. And in one circumstance that comes to mind, and this has really impacted me, we talk a lot about in social services, trauma-informed care. And there was an agreement with a local paramedic group, and this special group would come into shelter. And I remember in particular, there was a situation where one of the paramedics came to assess a woman in shelter and was very judgmental towards, why haven't you taken your medicine? Why is your diabetes? Why is your glucose level this high? And literally said, why don't you just hightail it to Ohio? And because she mentioned family, and just did not approach it with a trauma-informed care. And so I remember in that moment just thinking, okay, this is not okay. And I butted in and advocated on her behalf, recognized her desires and recognized this individual in the room, the victim. And then you saw another paramedic with the same group who did approach with trauma-informed care, had, asked for permission before he took vital signs, was very, very attentive and gentle with the women in shelter. And so all that to say is, for me, that job, that role was very meaningful in realizing that there are some people who, when you just help maybe speak louder to interject, but then let them speak, they will speak up and advocate for themselves. They just maybe need a little assistance getting started. And so that has stayed with me, in that advocacy is not just speaking for someone, but helping someone speak.
That's really good, Irene. I like that. Particularly that last thing you said. Sometimes we like to couch ourselves as, like a voice for the voiceless. But the truth is, unless you're an unborn baby, there are no voiceless. And we need to help empower people and help them to find their own voice. So I love what you said about that.
Yeah, along the same lines, John, one of the examples that I thought of was, I was in a policy-making kind of cohort a few years back for people and individuals with disabilities, and they brought in Lex Frieden, who was one of the architects for the ADA Act, and just hearing his own story of being a person with a disability and just the challenges to get the ADA passed and just all the things that he went through to get there. It was just incredibly inspiring to see the challenges and the triumphs and just kind of where we're at now thanks to the advocacy of people like him.
Yeah, that's good.
Katie and Irene went real, which is awesome. But I immediately think of Atticus Finch and To Kill a Mockingbird. And that was kind of one of the first times I learned about advocacy in school. And that was really powerful and impactful to me to see a man who had a case that was a loser of a case. Like he knew he was going to lose. And it didn't matter that he was right or that the facts were on his side. He was going to lose because of, the biases and prejudices of the audience or the listener. But he advocated anyway because it was the right thing to do. All right. So on the second part of that question, can you give an example of a time that you've advocated on behalf of yourself or someone else and just kind of what it was like, regardless of the result even? What was the result, but are you glad you did it? And was it hard to do?
Yeah, I immediately thought, John, of the last legislative session where we had that long day at the Capitol. Just for context for listeners, we had been at the Capitol for about 12 hours, but there was a hearing on a bill that was going to remove the R word from Texas laws. And my family's got some very personal experience with how hurtful the R word can be. And when I left Fort Worth that morning, I told my 12-year-old daughter, Eve, that I was going to give testimony to support removing the R word. And her eyes just lit up. She's like, you have to do this, Mom. You have to promise me that you're going to do this, that you're going to talk to them and make sure that they know how important it is for people like Lissy to be validated and supported and not use derogatory terms like that. And so it was just an incredibly high to be able to do that 12-hour wait of trying to get an opportunity to give my little 2-minute testimony of our experience with the R word and ask legislators to pass the bill and eventually see that bill be one of the first that actually was passed in the legislative session. It was came out of nowhere, but it was just fun to be a small piece of the history of making that legislation go through.
The example that comes to my mind, which was early in my experience with the CLC, and I almost hate bringing it up just because it brings back a dark time for us. But of course, I was hired during COVID, and during COVID in the U.S., there was just rampant hate crimes that seemed almost random towards people who came from Asian countries. And it wasn't even just the Chinese. And you would see a Vietnamese restaurant that had been vandalized, or you'd hear of just a person being stabbed on the subway or attacked in a Walmart parking lot just for looking like they might have been Chinese, but not even checking to see, not that makes it any better. And it was Katie and Michael Evans Jr., the public policy director at the time, that were like, hey, David, you need to speak up about this. And so we did a video about it. And then at my church, we brought it up as well. And we spent some time during the worship time praying for our international churches, that they would be strong and supported because they were getting threats as well. I remember our executive director at the time, Dr. David Hardage, started intentionally visiting some of our Chinese Baptist churches, and it was just kind of neat to see us responding in the ways that we could. We weren't right there to stop these things from happening, but we could show support afterwards and call it out and say, this is wrong on so many levels.
I think just in the spirit of CLC stories, I would say hunger offering decisions in the funding amounts and in the fundraising and asking for gifts, that in itself is advocacy, and letting people know that these ministries are worth supporting because of the amazing work that they do.
So good.
Yeah, so let me ask this, kind of piggybacking off of that, because each of y'all's examples came through your work at the CLC, which is excellent, but it would kind of be like asking a bunch of pastors what's great about evangelism, and they're all sharing about how because of their role as a pastor they get to share the gospel with people all the time. And the average church person is listening and going, okay, but that's not my career, right? My career may not provide me those professional opportunities to advocate, which is great. I have all of my examples are from my professional role as the director of public policy too. But to people who might be listening to this podcast who don't have the opportunity necessarily through their work, at least not in an official role, right? I'm not saying there won't be opportunities that come up at work, but it's not part of their job description to do that. What are some things that make it hard for people to advocate, do you think? And what are some ways that maybe they can get more involved in it? You know, part of my job is to help equip people to be advocates. That's part of the role of the public policy director, and to provide them with opportunities to do that, to help them feel equipped, trained, ready, and comfortable. And I'll be honest, that is not the easiest part of my job. You know, a lot of people are really uncomfortable with it, and a lot of people have built it up in their mind. They think it's harder than it is. It's always interesting to take people to the Capitol and them realize how easy it is to get an appointment with their legislator, or how easy it is to send a letter or make a phone call. It's not quite as daunting as we think it is. So what are some of the reasons you think people struggle with engaging in advocacy? And what might you say to, you know, our average listener who that's not part of their job description about, you know, seeking or finding those opportunities?
I think just the barrier of the unknown is always there. Not knowing who to reach out to. Will they even listen to me? There's definitely a sense sometimes of just, it doesn't matter, a sense of pessimism or cynicism that, you know, it doesn't matter. I think that's something that we engage and see frequently in our communities, and honestly, even in my own family, family members who feel like it doesn't matter, that no one's going to listen to me, that my voice doesn't matter. And so there's just that overwhelming kind of feeling sometimes that is a challenge, that we, you know, professionally, we have the opportunity to encourage that their voices do have an impact, and that there is an importance there. And even just in my own family, seeing just kind of the baby steps of getting into what we would call like advocacy. Some of it is as simple as attending board meetings for our local school, or joining the PTA, or getting involved in some things, and kind of, it's much less threatening than maybe entering the Capitol. And it also has a much bigger impact in your local community to be involved in those local things that are happening within your own neighborhood, your own backyard, your own church. It doesn't have to be a school board. Maybe getting involved in a church thing that you're interested in, serving on a committee within your church for something that you believe in or you believe is important. I think there's a lot of baby steps and easy entry points that people could look for to be able to see the impact that their voice can have.
That's really good. I think it's so true that you can have the most positive influence within your closest to home, you know, within your sphere closest to home. Kind of the further up you get to state and national levels, the dwindling impact sometimes.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that came to mind too for me, quite often I feel like because I'm bilingual, English and Spanish, I advocate a lot for Spanish-speaking individuals. And whether that's as simple as when I've taken my in-laws to doctor's appointments. And I remember particularly there was my mother-in-law. Quite often the specialists would speak directly to me, and that really frustrated me because even though she had very limited English, she's still an individual in the room and she's the patient. And so I remember advocating for that and helping remind them that I'm not the patient. I'm simply here to help the patient. And so I would say providing resources, in particular for individuals who may not speak the language or just may not be informed of where to access resources. John, you put out one of the recent elections, I can't remember when, but you put out a one-pager and basically helped provide where people can even go to fill out a sample ballot so that they can make informed decisions on who they were electing. And that I shared tremendously. I shared a lot with people how to even help them make an informed decision on who they were voting for. And so I think that in itself, just that awareness that, again, going back to empowering, helping others be informed of the resources available, to me, that was small, but also very impactful, because I could see this individual really light up and say, what, I can go prepared and not just click some buttons when I go to vote. That was new for them. And so I think that is a very important piece of advocacy, is even just sharing resources.
That's good. That's helpful.
Yeah. John, if I could appeal to people's selfishness with this one just a little bit. So you're saying we often do things because they're selfish. How about you'll be blessed if you advocate for others? that when you step out in faith and do something that you're not sure if you can do or not sure if it will have any impact, a lot of times we see God work in powerful ways, and that increases our faith. And what we're really doing when we're not advocating is missing out on opportunities to be a part of a work that God is already doing, and we could be joining him in that. That when we do advocate and speak up for these least of these, as opposed to just speaking up for ourselves, that also just shows the character of Christ of loving the least of these, which we've talked about recently on our podcast, and the witness that has. And I've always found when I've advocated for others, it's always made me more thankful for the rights and the blessings that I do have, and less likely to take them for granted.
That's really good, David, and it dovetails perfectly with where I wanted to lead our conversation next. So you're talking about growing in our faith and becoming more like Christ and loving others the way that Christ loves them. I want to talk a little bit about the distinctions between just advocacy, when we think about the term generally, and Christian advocacy. So when I speak at universities or to church groups or whatever, and I talk about advocacy, this is kind of the definition that I use when I describe it. I describe it as an appeal to those who are in a position of power, influence, or the ability to create change, to pay attention to what's important to you. And when I talk about Christian advocacy, it's very similar. I just changed the very end. So that's an appeal to those who are in a position of power, influence, or the ability to create change, to pay attention to what's important to Christ, to Jesus, to God, right?
Yeah.
And so there are advocates of all kinds. There are advocates of all faiths. There are advocates with no faith. But what makes Christian advocacy different, and why do you think that's important? And David has already given us some awesome examples about growing in your faith, how it will bless you, help you to become more like Christ. But what are some other things about Christian advocacy maybe that in your mind distinguish it from, say, a secular advocacy effort?
Seeking the interest of others. I think that when we have spoken before on the podcast about gambling, that may not resonate with people. It may not be a situation, gambling addiction may not be something that is as close to home, but considering the interests of others and considering how we can help others, I think that to me is just an easy way to say this law, or even, ACs in Texas prisons, to me, this may not impact someone I know directly, but how can we care for others? And so I think that is by far, when we consider the different policies that we advocate on, considering what doesn't just impact me or my circle, but what impacts all, because we know that God loves all.
I think one thing that stands out to me as I'm thinking of Christian advocacy is supposed to be embodying Christ's love in this world. One thing we know about Christ's love is that he was willing to risk and lose it all for our sake, literally dying on the cross for us. And I think Christian advocacy sometimes even means willing to risk losing something for the sake of others. In a small way, I would say that there are definitely things that we back at the Capitol that if they get passed might raise our taxes. And for some people, that's enough. That's already a line in the sand. I'm not going to do that if it's going to affect, in this economy, are you kidding me? Or is this really something we're going to be supporting? We can't afford this. So I think that's a small way, but there are definitely places around the world outside of where we live and the freedoms that we have, where Christians advocating for others does lead to imprisonment. It leads to death. And so it really is a tremendous sacrifice sometimes to even be an advocate. And Christian advocacy is saying, well, yeah, that sacrifice is kind of part of the gig. It's part of what it means to be a believer and how to show Christ's love. In fact, I have a better opportunity to show Christ's love if it's going to cost me something, so that is not going to slow me down. And I think specifically of, this goes back to your earlier question about examples we've seen that have impacted us, but I think of Fannie Lou Hamer during the civil rights movement. I learned about her from the book God's Long Summer. And she was a Christian in a Baptist church, an African-American, and she was doing everything to get her to be able to vote, even though she supposedly already had the right to vote. They were making her do literacy tests and giving all these other hoops to jump through. One time they were on a bus driving back just from a convention talking about, civil rights, and police stopped them and imprisoned some of them and had other African-American inmates beat her. And this was the risk that she was taking. And yet in the midst of this, she talked about forgiving people and not harboring hate towards anybody, because how did she put it in her words? I think I have a quote here. Ain't no such a thing as I can hate anybody and hope to see God's face.
Oh, that's so good.
That is Christian advocacy.
I think going along to me, adding to that is the cost of our time or even our discomfort.
Sure.
Because I think of, again, who may not feel comfortable going to the Capitol or even going to a school, a board meeting, a district board meeting, because, and I think of so many faces right now of people in my church who are predominantly Spanish speaking who say, I wish I knew the language better. I'm trying to learn the language better so that I can advocate. And so for those of us who English is our first language, to me, that's just such an easy way to say, I have the ability, because of my language dominance, to be able to help others speak, to be able, and yes, they can do so in other languages, but there is a difference being able to speak the English language. And so I think of that, it may cost us time or even discomfort to say, I don't know the system well, but you know what? One example is I love Spanish speaking individuals, and I think of faces who I know that they're trying to do their best to advocate. I'm going to use my voice to help them advocate.
So one other example I want to give you guys, one other distinguishing characteristic and get your feedback on is, I tend to find that Christian advocacy, by and large, this isn't always the case, is more systemic in nature and not so much focused on an individual. And I think that is borne out with examples of Scripture. I hope I'm not stealing anyone's example of scriptural advocacy, but when I think of like Esther,
you stole mine.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
That was everybody's. It's
All
fine.
right. Well, maybe I'll come back to that in a second and tie it back into this. So I will let Katie go and I'll tie that back into this. But
You can go.
But when I think of it, so for example, with our example, we've talked about air conditioning in Texas prisons, right? There is nothing wrong with self-advocacy that would say, I'm burning up in this prison and I've got to get AC, or I've got to get transferred to a place that gets AC. There is nothing wrong with advocating for a loved one and saying, my loved one is burning up in this Texas prison, and we either need to get AC in there or they need to get transferred to some place that gets AC. But part of the reason that these lawsuits in Texas haven't led to widespread air conditioning in every Texas prison is because a lot of the lawsuits are filed individually on behalf of myself or on behalf of a loved one. Christian advocacy, I think, in contrast to that, would say, no, this isn't about my particular situation or someone that I know personally, but how Jesus sees this situation and what Jesus would have to say about how we treat people in this situation. And it's really about every single Texas prisoner, even if I do not know their names or their crimes, that has been denied access to air conditioning. And I think we see examples of that in Scripture too, of not just, Lord, save me and lift me out of this particular situation, but entire groups of people, similarly situated people. What do you guys think about that, about kind of the slightly more systemic nature of Christian advocacy as opposed to other types of advocacy?
Yeah, I think it really is just the embodiment of living out loving your neighbor as yourself, right? This is part of caring for someone else, means, looking at those bigger systems of wanting to see that have a transformative impact on not just yourself, but your neighbors and bigger community groups by extension.
Yeah. So, one of the things that I struggle with sometimes when I'm talking with people about advocacy is they're like, well, where does it say in the Bible that I should go vote or something like that, And I can't point to a specific verse that says, hey, get involved with your city council or your school board, or look, here's the Bible verse that says to write to your senator, right? But there are verses that talk about seeking justice and caring for others, and we've already alluded to some of those. I want to share one real quickly that's rapidly becoming a favorite of mine because it is in itself an example of advocacy. It comes from Isaiah 1:17, and Isaiah is a prophet speaking to the leaders of the Jewish people, he's basically advocating on behalf of the Jewish people to their leaders. This is what you should be doing as leaders. So it's an example of advocacy, but also one of the commentaries I read phrased this, and I thought it was so great. It said, Isaiah 1:17, contains 5 admonitions for the practice of what is good. And I thought, how perfect, because that's what we talk about on our podcast, what is good. And so here's Isaiah giving these 5 admonitions for the practice of what is good. He says, learn to do good, seek justice. Number 3 is correct oppression, defend the fatherless. And number 5, plead for the widow. So that's one example, but I would love to hear from you guys some of your favorite examples of stories of advocacy in the Bible. Again, there may not be a verse that specifically says, write to your senator, but there are certainly stories that say go to the leaders of the people on those people's behalf, which is what writing to your senator is, and advocate for them. I have a really strong feeling that I could probably guess what Katie's story is going to be, and I really like it, so I want to hear from her first on this one. Katie, what is one of your favorite examples of advocacy in Scripture?
Can I go first and talk about Esther? Would that be okay?
Man, well, I think David's right. We all thought of Esther. She was obviously an advocate for her people, but also just the whole story is a story of advocacy. She was strategic. She was intentional. She was selected and called by God, by her family, to be in that situation for such a time as this. Obviously is kind of one of the most famous phrases that we have from Scripture, and really I think resonates with us because we see ourselves in that story as well, that has the Lord placed me in this situation for such a time as this, and is this my time to speak, just like Esther did. She was brave. She was risking something. I mean, she was risking her life to go before Xerxes, and still did it. And you see the impact of her advocacy immediately in the story as well. So I think it's really the Christian story of advocacy in the Bible.
Yeah. And tying in what David said earlier about the cost. And so she even said, if I die, I must die. Mm-hmm. So she knew the cost of it.
There's a risk and a cost to herself. And yes, she is advocating for people she cares about, Jewish people, her people. But she doesn't limit it. What would probably have been a lot less dangerous and come with a lot less risk and cost would have been for her to say, well, not me, save me from this persecution. I'm your wife. Or maybe me and my uncle, or me and some immediate family members. But she doesn't. She addresses the entire systemic issue, right, of this persecution of the Jewish people.
I'm glad you brought the uncle into this because I feel like there's another layer of advocacy behind Esther's advocacy, and that's Mordecai's advocacy to Esther in the first place. And I really love that part of the story because a lot of times we feel like, what can I do? But sometimes we can't do much, but we can talk to somebody who can do much. And so there's other ways to advocate, and you're seeing multiple layers of it. And I just love that about the story as well.
That's such a good point, David, of being able to say, I can't do something, but you can. And even just having the courage to say that, it can be vulnerable sometimes to put yourself out there, to ask someone to use their power in a way that could endanger them. That's brave in and of itself.
Yeah.
And she had access in and he had access out. And so she says, go tell the people to fast and to pray. And so he was able to go back and do that and tell others to rally that support.
Okay, and I love that. And I want to tie it back into our CLC because I think this is just such a great picture of our work, right? Now, we are not, the queen, so we don't have that kind of power. I'm not saying we have great power, but I see this play out with us. I see people come to us and say, hey, CLC, have you thought about this issue? Here's what we're experiencing. Here's what we're seeing in our community. It's hurting in this way. Is there a bill you can help get passed? Is there someone in the legislature you can talk to about this? And we say, yes, there is. And then often we turn around and come back to our churches and say, please write to your representative. Please join us in testimony at the Capitol. And in the same way that Mordecai comes to Esther and says, we really need you to do something about this. And she says, I will, but I need you to pray and fast and petition and get involved too. Our CLC kind of does the same thing. We hear about these issues Texas Baptists care about. Yes, we're happy to advocate on them, but then we also need the help of our churches. We need them to join us in this effort. Yes. And so I think it parallels the story of Esther really well. What a great choice, Katie.
Good job, Katie, our intrepid leader.
Good job, Esther.
Anybody else have another example, a different example maybe of Scripture that comes to mind about Christian advocacy or pre-Christ advocacy?
Well, I was going to go to one of Jesus' parables, and
that's great.
That's the parable of the servant who is, or the man who's first forgiven a huge debt, and then goes and is really oppressive towards another slave who owed him just a little bit of money. And you see the other slaves see that and then go back to the man who forgives him. And basically they're tattling. But nevertheless, even though it's a story that's mostly about forgiveness, you do see advocacy in there. You see them pointing out, this is a wrong that has happened, and we can't just sit by and watch this. And I think that's a huge part of advocacy is there's so much that we see that we just sit by and watch.
Yeah.
So
I don't know. We're working with our daughter on the issue of tattling right now. I don't know how you guys handle that as parents, but our main differentiator is like, what is your goal? What are you trying to accomplish? Are you trying to get someone in trouble, or are you trying to help someone and make a positive change, in the situation?
Oh, that's good, John. I'm writing that down.
It's really good. And in the spirit of mentioning our children, the one that came to mind for me, I will go Old Testament, is Moses. And so that's one thing that's right now Caleb is learning about the plagues, and but just the fact that Moses was asked go to free Israel, they were under oppression, they were under slavery, and go to the Pharaoh. And so Moses was the adequate leader that the Lord chose to be able to lead them into that exile. And so he didn't want to go. And so I think so many people, I know at least I've definitely find myself of that. Well, who am I? Who am I to go? I can't speak. I can't give testimony. And so I find myself like Moses of that fear of what do I have to say? And so I think that's just that reminder of he just had to be the vessel. He just had to be obedient. And oftentimes I think in advocacy, sometimes again, just looking at the resources, and if God is prompting something on our heart to speak about, then really also just leaning into being directed by the Holy Spirit and seeking his guidance on what to say.
One other thing I wanted to share too about advocacy as we wrap up is I think it can really help combat the polarization issue that we have in America and our political system and that kind of thing. And here's how I think about that. When we don't advocate, when we just sit and form views, it's so easy to fill ourselves only with the people who are like-minded on that issue with us, only the people who think the same way that we do. We can get into an echo chamber. We get all of our information from the same source. But advocacy, by its nature, you're not going for a pep rally for people who already agree with you. That's not advocacy. They already agree with you. You're going to someone who may be on the fence or maybe flat out disagrees with you to persuade them to your point of view on this issue in order to instigate change. And so you will hear criticism. You will hear feedback. You will hear the other point of view. You will hear nuance. You may learn that the issue was not quite as black and white as you thought it was before you try to persuade someone. They say, yeah, but what about this? Or have you thought about people in this situation? And so you expand your view on things. You get a more holistic view on things. You realize that none of these issues that seem so partisan, so Republican or Democrat, are actually quite as partisan as they seem, because there's a lot of nuance to them.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of what ifs about all of them. And so by engaging in advocacy, you intentionally expose yourself to a different point of view, to the counterpoints to your argument, to people who think differently. Even if you still feel they're wrong at the end of the day, it certainly helps you figure out where your arguments are weak or make you think more about why you believe the way you do on a particular issue. And so I think in that way, advocacy can help with the increasing polarization. I think if less of us just did the keyboard warrior thing and got out and actually engaged in advocacy, actually went and talked to our school board and learned how much these people care for children, regardless of whether they agree with you on this issue or not, regardless of whether they affiliate with a particular party or not, that focus on your common goals of improving education or improving schools for all children. I think you can learn a lot, and it can kind of deal with some of this hyper-partisanship.
I love that you point out the importance of just, for lack of a better word, embodiment, that there's a part of Christian advocacy that's just actually showing up and making relationship and connections with other people. Like you had mentioned, the keyboard warriors, I think one of the reasons we're at such a polarized point is like we're just not making those human connections anymore, that we're really missing out on that, and that there's a fundamental part to advocacy which is just the showing up part of physically being there, talking with someone, and the value, just the net value of that alone has on a situation.
Yeah. Thank you guys so much for just another fruitful and thoughtful discussion about advocacy today. We love to advocate for the things that are good, and we love to talk about what is good. So as is customary for us in wrapping up this podcast, I just kind of want to go around and hear from each of you what is good. So I will start with David. David, tell us something good.
All right. Well, when this episode comes out, we'll be about 3 weeks away from the next Bits for Bites.
Woohoo!
Awesome.
So what is good is raising money for the Texas Baptist Hunger Offering. What also is good is playing video games. What's really good, you know how God said at the end of it, this is really good? What's really good... I'm almost blaspheming here. I apologize. What's really good is when you can put both of those things together. So on my Twitch channel on August 8th, from 9 a.m. till 3 a.m. the next morning, I'm going to be marathoning video games on Sancho Panda on Twitch. No spaces. People ask me where the Sancho Panda came from. That's because my mom loved Cervantes. She loved Don Quixote. And so Sancho Panza. But then since I've also done ministry in Chinese churches, we changed the Panza to Panda. And there you go. So tune in. There will be opportunities to get Waluigi hats that I will make for people who donate a certain amount, or Mario plushie stars for people who donate a certain amount. And we're just looking forward to this opportunity to raise money through the Hunger Offering through our hobbies.
Love it.
Me too. That's awesome. Irene, what's good?
I'm laughing because I'm like, I would have to go under right after promo for Hunger Offering as well. But today I was having a bit of a stressful morning, and when I went to get the tape to put the sign on my door that said podcast and recording, I opened my drawer and I realized that I still had one bag left of extra hot Cheetos. And I had a big smile on my face because possibly one of my stress eating go-tos, not possibly, it is one of my stress eating go-tos. And I'm just very grateful for the provision. I'm quite sure from Katie, recently.
Yeah, for listeners, just to be aware, Irene loves the spiciest of the spicy hot Cheetos, and they're really hard to find. And when she made me aware of that, it just became a fun little hobby. Whenever I travel, and we travel a good bit for our work here for the Texas Baptist, when we find the black hot Cheetos, we get them, and it's always
they changed
so fun.
the color now. FYI.
Oh no.
This is the original one, and now it's a different, because the black is now on regular hot Cheetos.
What? Well, what is it now? We need to advocate for people who love spicy Cheetos.
On the extra hot Cheetos, it's now red, so it's like they flipped it.
Interesting. I'm glad you told me that, and I didn't start buying you the wrong kind.
So our podcast has not skyrocketed to national levels of fame or whatever, but there are podcasts where if you do that kind of thing, the next week you have hundreds of bags of Cheetos because listeners like to send, stuff in.
I like crisp $100 bills. I just want to send that out to our listeners.
Any of our listeners can still send any of that into me.
Katie, what's good?
Okay, so what's good for me is I'm actually going to plug another podcast that I really enjoyed this last week. It's called Hard Fork. It's where I get a lot of my tech and AI news. But if you want to go back and listen to the episode that dropped last Friday, they interviewed patient one who has the Neuralink from Elon Musk in his brain. And it's a fascinating, just really cool interview. And you get to hear from him and his personality and how this technology has really transformed his life and all the new things that he has access to that he didn't have before. He gave an example of just being able to read a book and his ability to turn a page with the Neuralink and just the value that and the quality of life that that's given him. It was humbling. It was inspiring. As a parent to a child with mobility disorders, even thinking about the potential that could impact her maybe in 20 years was really exciting and inspiring. So highly encourage everyone, go listen to it, Hard Fork Podcast, and it will bless you.
Wow. I have started having, like, when I'm hosting the episode, like a backup thing that is good in case we mention the same things, because not very often, but sometimes we get on the same page. And I need not have worried, because no one's what is good is as shallow as my what is good, which is Dallas Maverick basketball, or more specifically, or more generally, like Dallas sports in general, because I'm going to throw the Stars in there and the recent Texas Ranger championship from last year too. But like, I am loving Dallas sports right now.
Yes.
And just every night there is either a Western Conference championship basketball or hockey game on. And it's a lot of fun. I'm not in Dallas, I'm displaced, but those are my teams still. And, it's been really fun each night to be able to watch some Dallas sports, and particularly I'm a big fan of Luka Doncic and the Mavericks. We've talked about that on here before. We all did the where were we during the 2011 championship run, and it's fun to see another one. It's looking like maybe we'll be in the finals and have another opportunity at a championship run, and it's just been really fun to follow. I'm loving it.
CLC watch party.
Hey, now there's an idea. All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us for another episode of What is Good, a Christian Life Commission podcast. We really are enjoying doing this. We hope that you're benefiting from it and enjoying it as well, and we can't wait to be with you next time. I don't know if you're trying to throw me off my game before we start this podcast, but it's working.
I was going to say, John, are you ready?
No, not anymore. I got to refocus here.
How would you used to get like psyched up or ready for like a court hearing or something where you had to do something very lawyery?
I don't know if you guys have ever seen the TV show Better Call Saul. He goes in front of the mirror and he looks at himself in the mirror and he goes, "It's showtime," and he throws his hands out and goes, "Showtime." And there's a montage where he's doing case after case because he's like a public defender, and the only way he can make money is by volume. And so he just has to turn out case after case because it's sheer volume, business. And there's a montage of him in front of the mirror just going, "It's showtime, it's showtime," over and over in front of the mirror, right? And that's how he's about to go in front of the jury for another case. I don't look at myself and say it's showtime, but I would go into the courthouse bathroom and look at myself in the mirror and kind of like, I might even start with like a ladies and gentlemen of the jury type, like repeating my opening line to myself, like my opening line of my opening or closing statement. That's how I did it.
That's cool.
And even just now, as we were talking, I was thinking to myself, okay, now what's the opening line for the podcast? But then we started talking about flatulent songs, and it got very difficult for me to remember what it was.
Sorry, John. Okay, for the record, it was the song "I Love Beans," which is a great song. I don't get nervous when I speak. I don't do any sort of prep because as soon as I'm about a minute in, my nerves are mostly gone.
Yeah.
Unless it's a topic where I have to measure my words the entire time. Mm-hmm. But musically, I'm a bunch of nerves if I have to perform musically. And what helps me the most is just running my hands under warm water because my hands get cold, and it like fools my brain into thinking I'm calm. To run my hands under warm water and make them warm again.
I don't know if you did that just because you found it was soothing, but my sister, her counselor told her just touching water has a regulating impact. And so when she would feel a panic attack coming on, they would tell her to like just go put her feet in the pool or something like that. So there's some science there that's actually legit. Oh, are you drinking the water you just stuck your hand in?
There wasn't as much. I watched.
I couldn't reach it. I'm still unsoothed right now.
I did watch that you did not touch the water.